Well, hello and welcome to the Aletheia Forum. My name is Stuart Cashman. I'm hosting the evening. Well, it would have been an evening. Unfortunately, due to a technical issue, we didn't manage to record it the first time around. But welcome anyway to this rerun so you can see what I spoke about, which was this topic of what is your biggest hope in life and death. I want to go through the presentation I gave that evening, where there are lots of pauses for me to ask rhetorical questions. You might pause the video and think about some of those. And if at the end you have questions or things you want to ask about or comments you want to make, you should be able to have the comments signed on here on YouTube, or else feel free to email me at Emmanuel Brentford at gmail.com. That's emmanuelbrentford@gmail.com. I mean, do get in touch. I'd love to know what you think. Anyway, the topic of this first Aletheia Forum is, what is your biggest hope in life and death? It's sort of remind us of the purpose of the Aletheia Forum. The Aletheia Forum exists to provide a place for a discussion of important ideas in a respectful manner at a time when society can seem increasingly divided. So if you're here for a discussion, if you come for a discussion online another night, no questions or opinions are out of bounds. You want to send me a question or opinion? That's fine, please do. The other thing I'd ask is that we all listen to others as you would like them to listen to you. That we listen to others as we would like them to listen to us. So I'll endeavor to do that with whatever questions or comments you send me. But as we kick off, I want to see what we mean about the word hope. And so I've got a couple of cartoons which I want to show you from this book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. It's a beautiful picture book. I like books with pictures. Let's have a look at this one. We all need a reason to keep going, said the horse. What's yours? You three, said the fox. Getting home, said the boy. Cake, said the mole. A beautiful series of cartoons, interesting to think about. But I want us to notice something here. First of all, hope is, as I mean it in this context, this discussion, is a reason to keep going. Hope is a reason to keep going. And look at the different characters here, what their reason to keep going was. For the horse, it was relationships. For the fox, anyways, you three, the fox says. For the boy, it was getting home. Just getting home is what my meaning is giving me meaning. It's a reason to keep going, he says. I wonder if you can identify with that, the feeling of not quite being at home right now, something's wrong. Maybe lockdown is continuing if you're still around the time this was recorded. You want to get home in the sense of back to normal. Or cake, said the mole. He was just interested in satisfying his desires and appetites. And I'm sure we all know that as a reason to keep going at times. But the reason I'm saying that hope and meaning are important or related is partly based on the observations and work of this man, Viktor Frankl, who lived back in the last century. Now, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist. He was Jewish. He was caught up in the war and interned in a number of concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, he observed himself and his fellow prisoners and concluded that it was the quest for meaning that was the difference between survival and not surviving. But by and large, if people had a reason to keep going, a meaning, then that sustained them. And that's what I'm calling hope, a reason for keeping going. So I'd like to pause. You might want to pause the video if you want to think about this. Think, to what extent do you think it's true that everyone needs a hope, a reason or meaning to keep them going? Is that your observation? Is that how you feel? And secondly, I think, and this was recorded while lockdown was still happening. So what gave you a reason to keep going? What gives you a reason to keep going, even through lockdown, through disappointments and difficulties you faced in life, through ill health, through bereavement? Many have lost loved ones during this time. What keeps you going. And finally, just think about, where do people look for hope in a crisis and meaning in life? Where do you think people look? Well, I want to suggest there are a number of places people can look for hope. Let's see what you think about this. For some, we'll look for science. Look to science for hope. We've often heard that said by the government in the UK in the last 12 months. We've seen it trumpeted on newspapers and news magazines when the vaccines first were rolled out. Science providing a hope of the vaccine. Some of us hope for a change in circumstances for the better. You know, one day lockdown will end, normality will be restored. One day I might get better. One day I might get a new job. One day I might win the lottery. Change in circumstances. Or for others, it's that sense that individual freedom to pursue our own ideas of good and discover our authentic selves. That's our reason for meaning. That's our purpose in life. That's what gives us a hope. We'll find this great freedom to pursue what we feel is good and discover our authentic selves. And that particular conclusion comes from a man called Delbanco, who is a chair of humanities at Columbia University. He's now director of American Studies at Columbia University in New York. And he wrote that in his book, The Real American Dream. And he breaks it down into a number of areas: meaningful relationships, the ability to satisfy our material needs and desires, e.g. a home in the country or career success, or a happy, loving and safe home. Those kind of ideas we saw earlier in The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. Home, relationships, satisfying desires, having meaningful relationships. But I want to ask the question, is there a source of hope strong enough to give endurance and meaning in situations that we cannot actually change? So what about, for example, when the cancer will not go away? I think of a friend of mine who's desperately ill, halfway through chemo, and things seem to be getting worse rather than better. Or when the injustice will not end. We see so many situations of that in our own nation and around the world. We can't bring justice around on our own, can we? And how about is there a hope strong enough to give endurance and meaning in the one situation that is inevitable for every one of us, the one event that we all know we face, and that is death? It's a cartoon from The Guardian back in February 2021. The whole title was The COVID Remembrance Garden. And here you see the reasons for death listed on the tombstones. Test untraced, stayed alert, rest in PPE, trusted PPE that wasn't good enough. Just one of the herd, went along with the crowd, used common sense, but that wasn't enough. Ate out to help out, and yet contracted the virus. So actually the truth that stands behind this is very plain, isn't it? Even if it is not COVID that takes us, one day death is coming to us all. This is often a topic of literature. Is there a hope in the face of death? As one writer wrote, is there any meaning to life that my inevitable death does not destroy? And that was this man, Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina and Death of Ivan Ilyich. Now, Tolstoy wrote that line, is there any meaning to my life? Any meaning to life that my inevitable death does not destroy? He wrote that in his book, The Confessions. He goes on to tell how he sought fame and success through writing, and through wealth and family. How do we cope with death? How do we cope with death in our age? Well, many of us just ignore it, don't we? I did a funeral for a man a couple of years ago, and despite having a terminal illness, he'd never really spoken to his family about death. To begin with, I was quite surprised about that, but then reading around a bit more, I discovered quotes from the 16th century and the 17th century saying that this is the way human beings are. We grieve greatly over someone who dies, but then move on and treat that person, even if we love them, as if they're just the corpse of a dog in the street, and we don't apply it to ourselves. Or we fill our lives with other things so we don't have to think about death wrote Blaise Pascal, the French polymath, in the 18th century, in the 1700s. So it's not just a modern thing. What is a modern thing is to just dismiss death as a natural part of life. So, for example, the Lion King, the circle of life, as Mufasa says to Simba that all their ancestors are up in the stars above them. And then when they die, they go back to fertilize the ground, and then the antelope can eat the ground and can eat the grass, and then the lions can eat the antelopes, and that's it. It's all part of the circle of life. Death is just a natural part of life. I wonder how you think about that. Do you think death is just natural? If it is, then how come it causes us so much pain when loved ones die if it's just a natural thing? And secondly, what hope does it offer to believe death is just the end? That's it. Then you're just being recycled in the universe, in the circle of life. Does that bring you hope and comfort? Never mind, do you think that really is it? And if death is just the end, if it's just part of the circle of life, then how do we explain why most cultures in history have seen death as a tragedy, and the fact that we actually feel it as a tragedy when a loved one dies? Well, why is that? And also, I want to say, what has motivated us as a nation to endure so many lockdowns in the last 12 months? Stay at home, save the NHS. Face, space, masks. Save the NHS, save lives. Isn't it we've been motivated by a fear of death? Or a fear of hospital beds not being there for us if we're dying? So let me ask again this question. Is there a hope that can face anything, even death? And in response, and to try and answer that, I want to give an example from history. I want to consider what made the hope so attractive, and then ask a very important question. Is this reasonable hope that I'm talking about, or is it just the opiate for the masses, to borrow a line from Karl Marx? And I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that. So I want to give us an example of the hope that provided meaning and endurance. This example. The slaves in the cotton fields of the southern US in the 19th century, with the heat burning down on them, with no rights, with no prospect of change, and certainly no ability to change their own circumstances, apart from perhaps the lucky few who managed to escape to the north. But even that was not simple. Where did they find a hope that provided meaning and endurance for them? Well, as we consider their example in history, think about the songs that sustained them in the face of injustice and death and having no property of their own. And here's a song, for example, which England rugby fans will know. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Don't ask me how it ended up as a rugby song on the terraces of Twickenham, but bear with that for a moment. Look at these actual words and think what these slaves were singing as they sang together, working under the bearing hot sun in Alabama and places like that. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. By the way, I'm not singing this because that would really not help. Band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home. Tell all my friends I'm coming too, coming for to carry me home. I'm sometimes up, I'm sometimes down, coming for to carry me home, but still my soul feels heavenly bound, coming for to carry me home. I want to notice a few things about that. First of all, it's home. It's a desire for home, like the boy in the story at the beginning. There's a sense of this world is not where I belong. There's somewhere else where I'll truly belong, where I'll be accepted and loved and safe and secure, because that is ideally what a home is, isn't it? If you're a parent, that is the kind of home you long for your child to have. It's the kind of home we all longed for when we were growing up, isn't it? A place where we're loved, we have meaningful relationships, where we're safe. Sadly, we don't all have those homes, do we? But then secondly, do you know, just there's this theme of relationships here as well. Tell my friends I'm coming too. It's not going to be a lonely, isolated, individualistic existence. It's going to be relationships. Another element that kept them going: hope, home, relationships. And finally, this profound belief in life after death. The supernatural, indeed, angels coming to take me. My soul feels heavenly bound. There is life after the injustice and pain and suffering of this world. And let me take another example here. Another song perhaps we know less well. Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass, were the words of the song. So let me just read it to you. Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass and die and lose your soul at last. I know that my Redeemer lives. Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass. Sinner, oh, see the cruel tree where Christ died for you and me. I want to point out three things as we go through this. Firstly, you can imagine they'd be seeing this during the harvest times. They'd be collecting the cotton harvest. But they're not just talking about that. So there is a sense in which they're saying, take this time now as an opportunity. But they're using that word harvest with a kind of double meaning. Because in the Bible, the harvest is often a description of the day the Bible says Jesus Christ will return and judge the world and gather in his harvest, gather in those who are his people into his heavenly kingdom. Now, whatever you think about that idea, just bear with it for a moment and understand that as these slaves are singing this song, this is what they're singing about. That one day there will be a day of judgment, a day of putting things right. And so don't let this opportunity of this present time pass. So when that judgment comes, you lose your soul. The second thing I want us to notice is the word in verse 3 there, sinner, oh, see the cruel cross where Christ died for you and me. So again, that's a reference to the Bible story, to Jesus, the eternal Son of God, dying on a cross, dying a death of great pain, great shame and dishonor, and absolute injustice. And the Bible's explanation is he did that to redeem, to rescue, to buy back people like you and me, people who are trapped, who could not help themselves, who are destined to fall in that judgment. But Jesus paid for that himself. That's what the Bible teaches. And lastly, my God is a mighty man of war. Sinner, don't let this harvest pass. Again, that's another allusion to the Bible and God being a man of war, acting in justice to put things right, to put right every wrong that's been committed, every injustice. So he's on the war against those who pursue injustice, those who do what is wrong. And that the only way to be on the right side of God, the sort of story song is singing, is to accept that rescue, that redemption, verses 2 and 3 talk about. So let me pull out some particular things here. There's a great belief in life after death, isn't there? And that will be fostered as the people would sing it together. Don't lose your soul at last. There's something eternal about human beings that will live forever, one way or another. You don't want to lose it. And then secondly, I want us to see that this gift, this ability to have a soul that lives forever, is not something that's earned by being good, but is a gift. Sinner, see the cruel tree where Christ died for you and me. In other words, it's only through receiving the gift of Christ dying on the cross for those who believe in him that we get the gift of having eternal life with him and being forgiven and having the wrong things we've done, the wrong attitudes we've had, taken away from us, and the penalty for them paid for us. So it's a gift. It's not earned by being good or not earned by having such a hard time in this world. These slaves, some of it is being a gift that God can give to those who trust and believe. And the third thing to point out, which I've already mentioned, is that there is this strong belief in justice at the end, that God is a mighty God who will put all things right. Now, what made this hope so attractive and powerful? I want to suggest a number of things. Firstly, it is a physical, not merely a spiritual hope, not a kind of vague idea, but a physical hope. I'll see more about that in a minute. It's a hope which ensures that justice will be done. It doesn't say, oh, it doesn't matter you've been treated badly. It doesn't matter there's been injustice and pain. Rather, God is this mighty God of war who will put things right. And thirdly, I thought what made it so powerful and attractive was a sense that it's not earned, but is a gift. I just want to show you a verse from the Bible that kind of backs this up. So right at the end, the second last chapter of the Bible, we see this vision. Oh, the Apostle John is one of the disciples of Jesus, but many years later, he saw this vision of a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. It's a picture of evil being no more, because the sea was where in this particular book in the Bible, was where the evil wickedness had come from. So those who love surfing don't need to worry about that. That's not quite the idea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. It's a physical hope. God dwelling with us, wiping tears away from our eyes. It's a world where justice will be done, and there'll be an end to injustice. No more death or mourning or crying or pain. And if you're able to read on, you'd see it was actually a gift. Now, this picture down in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen shows a painting from the catacombs in Rome where early Christians in the first century often hid. And archaeologists aren't entirely sure, it could be showing the scene of the final banquet that is promised in the Bible, which is one of the Bible's great pictures of the hope that God gives his people. Or it could be a picture of a celebration of the sort of feast that the early Christians held in anticipation of that event. But anyway, let me read to you another prophecy from the Bible, this time from 700 years before Jesus, which sums up what is attractive and powerful about this hope that kept the slaves singing. Let's say it's written about 700 years before Jesus was born. And it says this, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. It's a picture of a banquet, isn't it? Of real food, of real people, of real relationships, a sense of really being home. And notice it's all quality. It's all the things we long for. I'm sure it would even include cake for them all. And more than that, he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. That great ultimate statistic that 1 in 1 people die, whether it's from COVID or something else, God will obliterate death. Death is an enemy, is how the Bible views it. Not only that, in this new world, the Lord will wipe away every tear from their faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. I hope we can see, whether you believe this or not, help to see why this was such an attractive hope for those slaves. That death would come to an end, that God would wipe away all their tears, that they would be fed. But we need to ask the obvious question, don't we? Is this hope reasonable, or is it just an opiate for the masses, as Karl Marx famously said? So how can we believe God will make it right one day when there's so much wrong in the world now, there's so much suffering and injustice now? Isn't that just wishful thinking? Well, I'd like to give you an illustration from life, as well as an example from the Bible. I have a daughter who, when she was born in the United States. We lived there for a couple of years. And just before her first birthday, a week before her first birthday, the big pandemic at the time was the H1N1 swine flu virus. And so it was recommended she got a vaccination. So we had to take our poor little daughter, aged 11 and a bit months, down to a doctor who she'd never met. I had to hold her still while he forced a needle into her. You can imagine the tears and the upset, can't you? You can imagine how bad I felt as a dad holding my little baby, how terrible my wife felt looking on, helpless. But why did we do it? We did it because we knew and understood that this was going to be good for her health, be good for her ultimate well-being, which she couldn't understand at the time, being only 11 months old, or not quite a year old, and we being adults. We could understand more. And yet, a few hours later, we got a lovely picture of her smiling in my arms on a glorious autumn day by the Missouri River. Why do I say that story? Because even as children, there are things we cannot understand that our parents put us through, which seem like torture and unreasonable, but are actually there because they understand better and they're for our good, just like giving that vaccination to my daughter. Now imagine if that is true on a human scale, if there is a God who is all-powerful and all-loving, which is what the Bible teaches, then surely it's possible that he can use terrible things in our lives for our ultimate good. Just think of that as a thought experiment for a moment, whether you believe in the God of the Bible or not. A second piece of evidence I want to suggest is an example from the Bible itself. Those slaves sung about Jesus nailed to the tree. What happened there is that Jesus was betrayed by one of his friends, went through a sham of a trial before the religious leaders, then before the Roman governor, where there was no justice. They didn't follow the procedures, where 3 times the Roman governor declared Jesus innocent and yet still had him crucified. It was utter injustice. He'd never done anything wrong, and certainly not done wrong the things they claimed he'd done wrong. Nothing worthy of death, as the governor admitted. And yet out of that injustice, out of the death of someone who the Bible says was innocent of all sin, there was no deceit in his mouth, one of his followers said. Yet out of that, the Bible says that without that terrible injustice, good can come to all people who turn and trust Jesus. They can be forgiven and have a hope for the future forever. So if there's a God who is all powerful, and surely he can and all wise and all loving, then surely he can use situations we don't understand to work them for good. And that's certainly the situation in the Bible. So there's a couple of reasons why I think it's plausible to believe that God one day can put an end to suffering and injustice, even when there is injustice now. But there's another question, isn't there? How can we really believe that a dead man rose to life? Well, we could talk about this for hours. We don't have time because we're running out of time now. But let me just ask a few questions. Could Jesus have just not died but only fainted? That's a thing that often people say. But I want to challenge you to read the story in the Bible itself of how he'd been beaten and abused and mocked and beaten up, how he couldn't even carry his own cross. How could a man like that, then nailed to a cross, suddenly revived 2 days later after being in a cold tomb? How come the Roman centurion who said he was dead, how come he got it so wrong when they were experts at killing and had to die themselves if they hadn't killed a prisoner? So the second question is, well, who moved the stone from Jesus' tomb? Assuming he was indeed buried in a tomb, as the Bible records, who moved the stone? Well, the Romans wouldn't have moved it. They put a guard on it. The Jewish leaders wouldn't have moved it and taken the body because they were adamant he was going to stay dead. So there's another possible thing, isn't there? Could Jesus' disciples have just taken the body and made up the story of Jesus rising from the dead? Well, I want to ask, how many of them do you think would have died for something they knew was a lie, a story they just made up? If it's just a story they made up, would this hope have sustained Jesus' followers themselves, as many of them faced prison and even death for proclaiming Jesus had risen again? Or would it have kept the slaves going if they thought the story was just symbolic and not historical and real? I think these are questions worth asking. And how come the Christian message went out from a few weak people in this little province of Judea, and within a few years there's a church in Rome in the center of the empire, and the message was being preached in Athens, the center of learning? Well, it's a few thoughts. I'd like to hand it over to you for some discussion. You might want to pause the video now and think about it. If you've got any questions for clarification, please send them to me, emmanuelbrentford@gmail.com. Or if any comments, you can write them below, hopefully, have the comments switched on YouTube. Or any thoughts, again, email them or put them in the comments. But I want to think, what is your response? Have you heard of any of this before, or is it new to you? I also want to ask, does it make you think differently about what your biggest hope is? Do you have a hope that's big enough to endure all sorts of suffering and difficulty in situations you can't change, and even death? Does it make you think differently about Christianity? Perhaps the idea that there is, Christians would say, something reasonable behind it, or that it is a gift, not something we've earned. And finally, does it raise any questions for you personally as you think about this? Do give that some thought, please. And if you'd like to investigate this further, there are a number of ways you can do that. So there's a webinar on Monday, the 29th of March, if it's not already past that, where you're looking at it. A webinar for skeptics and believers. It's run by an organization called Christian Heritage. And the title is The Death of Death, How Easter Changes Everything. And the speaker at that will be Dr. Gary Habermas from Liberty University in the US. And if you want to book your place, you can do that for free. Hopefully I'll put the link up in a minute that you can go to do that. Well, there are other ways of taking this further as well. There are lots of books you can read. So I've got a book called Beyond the Big C by Jeremy Marshall. It's Beyond the Big Cancer. Jeremy was a man who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer about 4 or 5 years ago. And he writes very honestly about that situation. He writes from a Christian perspective, but it's interesting whether you are a Christian or not a Christian, or not quite wonder how anyone can endure that kind of suffering. And you can get that there, or I do at the moment have 4 copies. I can send you one if you like. If you want to think more seriously about whether Jesus could have risen from the dead, there's a book called Your Verdict on the Empty Tomb by Val Grieve. I think the best price for that is at 10ofthose.com. So you can look that up there. The same with Beyond the Big C. Or another book that looks at the evidence for Easter is The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was the legal editor for the Chicago Herald and Tribune. He was not a Christian, he was an atheist, but his wife became a Christian, so he started to investigate further and eventually came to believe himself. And The Case for Easter is specifically looking at some of the interviews he conducted around whether Easter could really have happened. Again, you can get at that, I think, more cheaply than you can on Amazon if you go to 10ofthose.com. And finally, if you're into something a bit more rigorous than that, or a bit more broad than that, then The Reason for God by Tim Keller. You can buy that from Amazon. You can buy it from 10ofthose.com. Might be slightly cheaper. Keller is the pastor of a big church in New York City, which grew from a very small handful to now a number of thousands, as he deals with skeptics and cynics and secular thinking. So the book's written for people really wanting to know if there is a reason for God. And finally, even more heavyweight, The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is one of the foremost New Testament theologians of our day, former Bishop of Durham, I should say, lecturer at St Andrews University. And it's a thorough academic level examination of the evidence for the resurrection. So that's pretty heavy, pretty expensive, but go for it if you want to have a look. And you can buy that most cheaply on Amazon, I think. Well, thank you for joining in, and do take this further. If you're watching it in time, then we've got a couple of future discussions. Is God plausible in a scientific age on Tuesday 23rd? And is forgiveness just weakness in the world of injustice? And I'll put the links up on the YouTube site, hopefully, or go to emmanuelbrentford.org, Aletheia Forum, to book your place. Thanks very much for watching.